7, Needless Havoc. And this was all about everyone's probably favorite, the Japanese beetle. So its scientific name is Ophilia japonica. But yeah, it comes from Japan. So that's why it's named Japanese beetle. Has everyone seen these before?
Yeah, they're pretty common. They grow to about half an inch long. As you can see here, you can tell it's a Japanese beetle by the green, head and thorax with the copper elytra, which is this hard wing cover of this area.
And they're very clumsy flyers. So much like our Newfound stink bugs, they kind of just run into everything. So they got here in the early 1900s. They think the larvae came in on a shipment of iris bulbs that were imported from Japan. In 1916 was the first documented find in New Jersey.
And they weren't really a big deal in Japan because they had lots of natural predators to keep them in check. But once they got here, none of those were applicable, so they started feeding on pretty much any plant that you could have. Some of the ones that we found were strawberries, peppers, grapes, blueberries, cherries, plums, pears, and about every plant I've ever heard of. So they pretty much attack anything.
So, yeah, their natural predators are the Cantacomidae beetles, which is the family of the stink bugs. We couldn't find whether or not there was a linkage in them bringing stink bugs as a predator. But yeah, since there's no predator, they're able to breed and spread westward pretty quickly. And the reason why it matters is because, when they feed on these plants, they skeletonize and essentially kill the trees.
And basically what it does here is it just eats all the foliage in between the veins, and this is what it looks like afterwards.
And this is actually in my backyard a few years ago. They annihilated an entire tree. They focused on one tree, it was dead by the end of the summer. So yeah, the government's method of control, when they realized that this was going to be a problem, was using pesticides, Dieldrin, which was mentioned earlier, and Aldrin, which is a similar pesticide.
So this is Dieldrin. Like many other insecticides discussed in the book, it is a chlorinated hydrocarbon. And in quail experiments that the government did, it was found to be 50 times more poisonous than DDT, which is pretty terrifying because DDT is very poisonous.
As we just said. So in 1954, they used Dieldrin in Indiana. There were 2,600 acres sprayed, and they sprayed it at 3 pounds per acre. So it's very heavily being sprayed from the sky. And by 1961, 131,000 acres had been sprayed. And the effects were similar, to what you see with DDT, the death of, birds, muskrats, rabbits, and a fox squirrel, which was pretty common in Indiana. By the end of the spraying, it was nearly wiped out. Like, you hardly saw anything there.
And when you look at 3 pounds per acre of Dieldrin, what you can think is that's 150 pounds per acre of DDT, basically, which really gives you an idea of how poisonous what they were dropping really was. And right here, it's talking about 1960, and the USDA opposed a bill that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service promoted, saying that they should communicate more and hopefully avoid them. And the USDA argued that they had already openly communicated with each other, and they really just didn't want to consult. And that just kind of expresses how the USDA didn't want to look at the consequences of what they were spreading.
Yeah, the way Rachel Carson talks about it. After we check Ryan's email.
It's not the whole video, just
Hi, I'm Jim Dill. I'm the pest management specialist with the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. I want to talk to you a little bit about Japanese beetles. Japanese beetle here in the state of Maine, depending on where you live and weather conditions, start coming out about the end of June. So give or take a week on either side of that. You're going to be able to look outside and you're going to find Japanese beetles just about everywhere. What we want to do is talk a little bit about the biology first. And the biology is, as I say, the adults are out somewhere around the end of June, 1st of July. First thing they do is they start looking for a food source. Once they start feeding on the food source, the next thing, priority, is finding a mate. Once they find the mate, they go ahead and start mating and start laying their eggs probably somewhere around 10 days later. So you can figure most parts of the state by the middle of July to the end of July, the Japanese beetle is laying eggs in the turf. And the larvae hatch somewhere a little while later, maybe a couple weeks. So now we're into August, middle of August, and you've got larvae feeding on the roots of your grass. So when we want to talk about management, you've got two different strategies you got to work with. One, you can work with controlling the adults, and the second strategy is to what to do about the larvae. One of the things that I suggest is just go ahead and fill a container with water, get a little dishwashing liquid, put just a little bit in. Once you got a few drops of it in, that breaks the surface tension of the water so that the beetles fall in it and drown. Then all you do is you bend over wherever your beetles are, if it's your roses or whatever, and place the bucket underneath, and then just start tapping. Now yes, a lot of them will fly away. That's just the nature of them. The next method of controlling them works great, especially if you have kids. For some reason, kids just love to get out there. It's just a regular old car vacuum, a hand vacuum, whatever you want to call it. You just charge it up, and all you do is you really go out there and you just vacuum up the beetles. And once you vacuum them up, you've got them in here. Admittedly, once you've done this with this, you probably want to dedicate the vacuum for doing that forever, because it gets a little messy inside. Same thing, you open it up, dump it into soapy water, and the adults drown. There are several materials that are also available to the homeowner that are organic in nature. They spray pesticides, and they work quite well. A couple of them are ones that contain some type of insecticidal soap. The insecticidal soap actually smothers the adult beetles. The other one that you can use is something containing neem, and this actually is an anti-feedant, and what it does, it prevents the beetles from feeding. Once you spray it on, they stop feeding, and eventually will leave the plant alone, and they will die because it has also some toxic effects to the beetles. The last thing I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about it, and that is Japanese beetle traps. Everybody asks, should I use Japanese beetle traps? And of course the big joke is, yeah, you give them to your neighbor, put them in his yard or her yard, and all the beetles go over there. Well, that's not so far from the truth, because what happens is, there's three things that act here when you've got a Japanese beetle trap. You've got the bright yellow color, and there's two different lures that we put in there. One is a pheromone lure that attracts just the males, and the other one's a floral lure that attracts both males and females. So they all come into this, and if this is sitting here, and this is what you're trying to protect, here's your rose bush, is sitting here, and as they come flying into this, they miss. They're not the best flyers in the world. They're good, but they're not the best at landings. So they get all over the roses. So even though your beggar bug or other Japanese beetle trap will just be full of beetles, they're great, they work, but you want to take and put a stake out and put your trap at least 50 feet away from what you're trying to protect. Now, Japanese...
So yeah, you know, again, a lot of my home neighborhood, I don't know about anyone else, was a lot of bags, and you may get a big collection of the bags, but it also ends up attracting all of these beetles.
My neighbors had one growing up, and I remember there was one time we were playing football, I believe, and the football hit the bag, and you would not believe how many beetles were in that thing. They were everywhere. I would never forget how many beetles there were. It was scary.
Well, that's it. So wanted to end on a description of what happened after dieldrin was sprayed, and this is of squirrels. This is just to give you an idea of how graphic, you know, it can become, the toll on life. So she's describing ground squirrels who had died from dieldrin. The back was bowed, and the forelegs, with toes off the feet slightly clenched, were drawn close to the thorax. The head and neck were outstretched, and the mouth often contained dirt, suggesting that the dying animal had been biting at the ground. And then, you know, Rachel Carson is by saying, by acquiescing in an act that can cause such suffering to a living creature who among us is not diminished as human.
Any questions?
Do you know, in terms of the stink bugs, are they going to try pesticides?